I'm not wanting to pray, but maybe I'll pray for that. Hello, team, and welcome to Bureaucracy. I'm your host, Emily Gross, and I'm very excited today because I have Kevin Burke with me, who is a professor of English education at the University of Georgia. We're going to be talking about the rise in Christian nationalism in education. Kevin, thank you so much for being here.
It's a real pleasure. Thanks for having me, Emily.
So before we dive in, what are we drinking?
I have an Oktoberfest from Terrapin Brewing here in Athens, Georgia.
Nice. Also, that's a very cool can. It's very trippy.
Yeah.
I have a Change of Heart IPA as a fish on it.
Nice.
Cheers.
Cheers.
So the question I always love to ask my guests is, why should we trust what you have to say?
A very fair question. I don't know that you need to necessarily. Went into doing a PhD in English education, having been an English teacher and religion teacher at a small Catholic high school down in Phoenix, Arizona. And I was going to study narrative writing. And then I ran into a book that looked at masculinities in a public high school. And I wanted to figure out what masculinities and religion looked like in an all-boys Catholic high school, because I had gone to one, and I want to figure out why I was so, let's say, messed up socially. And so I've been looking at religion and education ever since, so 2009 on, which doesn't mean I'm necessarily an expert in religion or theology, but I have read a good bit. And that took me to the effects of then religious nationalism on public education, because as an advocate of public education, who is also in Catholic spaces, often Catholic education and Catholic education advocates are pushing for school choice and vouchers. And that means that they are in troubling circles often when it comes to a commitment to democracy and public schooling. So that's how I landed on Christian nationalism, white Christian nationalism. Whether I'm an expert is kind of up to you, I would think.
No, but I mean, listen, you've done more research than I ever have. So you're an expert in my books. So you recently wrote a very interesting study, I would say, along with Heidi Hadley, for the National Education Policy Center, to how Christian nationalism and education policy in the United States. You talk all about kind of the origins of Christian nationalism and the impact today. Would love for you to kind of give a debrief to the listeners about what it's about and what your findings show.
Yeah, so Heidi is a former student of mine. She's an assistant professor at Auburn University, really, really smart and thoughtful. She and I have both grew up with religious backgrounds, and so are interested in the ways in which religion inflects on the teaching practices of our students, because we're both teacher educators. The policy brief for the National Education Policy Center is centered on this idea that there are religious nationalisms, particularly white Christian nationalism, that have for a very long time influenced public education, but have gained increasing sway, particularly in the current administration, though not just in the current administration. We're drawn on a ton of people who are much better versed and I would say brighter than me. In particular, we rely a lot on Whitehead and Perry, so Andrew Whitehead and Samuel Perry, who talk about there are sort of four tranches of people in the United States in relation to Christian nationalism. There's rejectors, there's resistors, there's accommodators, and there's ambassadors. A lot of people fall in the middle, which are people who are not committed either way. You can think of, radical centrists if you want to in that regard. Rejectors are people who say that there should really be no impact of Christianity in our national project. And ambassadors are people who are pushing actively for it. Our findings essentially are that education is a powerful social system that shapes national identity and ideologies, and Christian nationalists in particular see that as a way to dominate the sphere of education in the United States. That's tied to the New Apostolic Reformation, which we can talk to later. But the four tenets that are probably most useful for our listeners here are: the United States was founded as a Christian nation and is divinely chosen and blessed by God. There's a rigid and clearly defined social hierarchy. And that's dichotomous. So it's males over females, adults over children, whites over other racial and ethnic groups. Preserving God-given freedom is of paramount importance, but it's really only freedom for the white Christian men who are at the top of the hierarchy. Yay me. And then
You made
for
it.
all
Congrats.
others, yeah, I know. Essentially like authoritarian and violent control in order to enforce that system. So it's pretty easy to connect the dots with, for instance, what's happening in our beloved Chicago right now, or the imposition of National Guard in any given place. Like essentially, you impose the hierarchy so that people will obey. And that's authoritarianism, but it's also tied to this white Christian nationalism.
It was interesting reading about kind of the origins going back to the 1600s of there being Christian influence in public education.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that was something that was new for me because one, I'm not educated in it. Two, I've always been under the assumption of separation of church and state. So everything that's not that, I've been like, well, then that's not an American value. But
Yes.
I can understand why some people think that Christian nationalism is tied to the foundation of American education and just American values. But it does feel like it has grown tremendously. When did it kind of shift between, like the 1600s to the belief of separation of church and state?
Yeah, I mean, so the old diluter Satan law, which is one of the better named laws that you'll
That's
run
incredible.
into.
Spectacular.
Essentially, yeah, in the state of Massachusetts said that if you had a certain sized community, you needed to establish a public school so that the kids could be educated so that they wouldn't, idle hands at the devil's playground kind of thing. You don't want to lose them to the devil. So the big shift is essentially in the wave of immigration that happens in the late 19th and early 20th century, when you have essentially non-traditional Protestant communities moving in, and at the time, like non-white ethnic European communities. So Irish Catholics, Italian Catholics, German Lutherans, and then significant Jewish populations. Up
That's
until
my
that
people.
point, yeah. Up until that point, essentially, like the understanding was, well, of course, any sort of public educational project in the United States is going to carry sort of non-denominational or pan-denominational Protestant values. Like that's just what it is to be American. So all of the textbooks that were used at that point, like the McGuffey Readers and the New England Primer, like these were essentially all pseudo-biblical texts. And then there's a clash, the Catholics are like, well, we've got a different Bible. So could you not like impose your Bible on us in the schools? And that was a real problem. There were like actual, there were murderous riots in Baltimore and then in New York over this. And so what happens then is you have pushback, you have the establishment of these denominational educational systems, and then you have the imposition or the attempted imposition of the Blaine Amendments, which is essentially like trying to ban religious education schools. So banning Catholic schools or banning German Lutheran schools, because the point at that point was like we all of a sudden under progressive reformers in public education in the 1910s, 1920s, we see education as a way to Americanize these non-white Europeans who have come. So we got to get them in the public schools because we got to teach them the language so that they can be more American. This may sound a little bit resonant and familiar.
Yeah, no, it sounds familiar.
Yeah. So, but the idea was, okay, if we're going to get all these people in public education, then maybe we can't do an explicitly congregationalist Protestant project in the schools. And that's when you start getting court cases where you get an establishment of, okay, so the public education has a role in the state or is the state and represents the state. And we're going to have a certain kind of jurisprudence, especially in the Warren Court in the mid-century, in the 20th century, that says like, well, we can't establish religion in the schools. And establishment looks like requiring people to say the Lord's Prayer every day or requiring them to read a certain kind of passages in the Bible. And so that's really when you had this, they call it essentially like a religion of Americanization as opposed to a denominational Christian religion. And that's also when you get a great deal of this prefiguration, which we can talk about later, which is like, well, they took God out of schools and that's why everything has gone poorly from Christians and Christian nationalists very specifically. But it's true, as you say, like the public educational project in the United States for a very long time was pan-Protestant Christian. And there's a nationalist component to that. So we have to be honest about that. More recently, though, the argument in that NEPC brief is that it's shifted in ways that we should be concerned about.
It is so interesting to me how Christianity has become I guess it has been in the American sense, but it's such a white, hierarchical, male-dominated religion that's been, that's what it's been like transformed into in a lot of ways, and especially people using it to impose their own beliefs, which feels wrong and incorrect. It's just very interesting to me that that's how Christianity has been interpreted in the American tradition.
Yeah, but I don't know that we should let anybody off the hook in terms of their interpretation of Christianity. Or like religion is pretty notoriously hierarchical and patriarchal, and especially Christianity. There was, at least for, there is a brief moment in I'd say the middle 20th century on through to, let's say, maybe 2016. For various reasons, where you had really substantial progressive modes of Christianity that sought to establish a different kind of system. But then the mainline Protestant churches have kind of emptied out, as have the Catholic churches, and people who have maintained religious sensibilities have often had a pretty, at least in the most recent context, have had pretty conservative commitments. And those conservative commitments have been transformed very specifically into political commitments from the moral majority and the new right, and over the last 50 years or so. And the religion, which was a wedge issue for a long time, is now pretty much explicitly, unfortunately, like a right-wing issue, or at least a right-wing value that's being advocated.
Why do you think that the concept of an education is tied to liberal ideology?
Oh, that's a great... I don't know that education itself is only ever tied to a liberal ideology, but I will say I work quite a bit in curriculum theorizing. And so curriculum theorizing thinks about two things very specifically, which is like the complicated conversation, currere. That's what curriculum is. It's a complicated conversation about what knowledge is of most value and what most ought we teach. And because in the United States in particular, you have essentially like one big socializing institution, because we don't really have a social safety net, and that's schools. And because public schools are the one place in which we often gather people, although less so, who are different from each other and have different values, like the clash is over what we should teach. So this is why you get, book bans, and why you get, pretty significant pushes now into local school councils by, for instance, Mom for Liberty. Because if you can advocate for the values that you have in the curriculum, then you can more or less indoctrinate large swaths of kids. So it's not that education itself has to be liberal. It is the case that often we have conflated knowledge, at least on the left, I think, with liberal values and education. And that, you can look at any number of conservative religious institutions in the United States, or conservative political educational institutions in the United States. Hillsdale would be one of them. Ave Maria would be another. They're doing education there. It's not necessarily liberal.
I would challenge you a bit, though, because I do feel like a lot of that rhetoric does come from the right-wing higher-ups of saying that liberal education is tied to anti-Christian beliefs.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
I wouldn't say it's just like a left-wing talking point. I would say it's pushed pretty hard from those that are trying to encourage Christian teaching and anti-woke teaching.
Yeah, I think that. That's fair. Although, if you think of, you often get people on the right who will talk about being classical liberals, right, which might be a different thing, but these are also the people who often push great books programs, which are liberal arts programs. I think that talking about education as a liberal value is as you say, it's a loaded term that might actually be different from the idea of the liberal arts. What's
the impact of this huge rise in voucher programs and homeschooling? How is this going to impact the next generation?
Yeah, it's a fair question. I mean, one of the issues, and you may have already talked about this with the closing down of the Department of Education, and maybe you talked about this with Kevin, is that, for instance, like the implementation of or the enforcement of idea, the Individual with Disability and Education Act, like that, the idea that we might provide accommodation for kids in public education. If you voucherize education and you don't have any accountability in schools anymore, which essentially in most states that have voucher and school choice systems, like there is less accountability in homeschooling, certainly, but also in religious schools. And there's less ability to sanction schools for not supporting kids with disabilities, for instance. So one version of that is what we have done is marketize the notion of education, which is education is a consumer good. And I will trade whatever voucher I have to get the kind of consumer good that I want my kid to have. What that does then is, by individualizing education and taking it out of the notion that we do it in community, suggests that we don't have a communal project of knowledge development anymore. That worries me immensely, because we're not constructing ideas together. What we end up with is the idea that I'm going to buy the education that I want. Really, really worrisome, because as we know, like, if everybody has a voucher and we have legacy institutions like schools with teachers in them, like there are fixed costs in those spaces. And if any kid can move at any given time, like those fixed costs become a real problem. And so you end up with teaching forces that get laid off, or you end up with buildings that end up dilapidated, or you end up with like essentially like an incentive to lay off more experienced teachers because they're more expensive. So I think the big concern that I have with vouchers in particular is there's no particular evidence that they improve student outcomes. Student outcomes are notoriously hard to measure, and the kinds of things that you measure may not actually be what we value in education, but they're like things that are easy to get, which would be like student test scores. And the evidence is pretty meh on whether and if they work all that well in that regard. So then the argument is like, well, the parent is the primary education of the child, so the parent should be able to choose to send their kids anywhere, which is often the argument of parental choice advocates, and often the argument of religious parent advocates, which is now like essentially, well, the state provides education for a public education for kids. They should also provide a religious education for kids, because then they have equal access. This is one of the ways in which First Amendment jurisprudence has shifted over the course of the last 10 years in the Roberts Court, which is essentially, if you're going to offer it in a public space, you have to fund it in a religious space as well. That's like brand new and really, really inherently frightening. And in those religious spaces, there's a deep resistance to any kind of oversight. And that's where money just ends up flowing to God knows what, in any case. Like the state of Georgia just enacted a voucher system, and the majority of the money from this last year went to Amazon, because you can buy supplies with it, you can buy computers with it, you can buy. So if you're doing like a virtual homeschool or whatever, so you can imagine how there might be an incentive from the business community to enact these voucher laws if they're really, really loose on how you can use them. So if you're using it on educational supplies, yes. So that we might be troubled by, because all of that money, we know from a lot of history in the voucher stuff is like, it has already, the people who take advantage of voucher systems are already in the private system often, majority. So you're just pulling money away from public education, which serves kids with the most need, and then just essentially can't provide services for those kids.
You mentioned it briefly in the Roberts Court, the way that the allowal of increased, basically, Christian nationalism into the education vein of our country. How has that changed especially in this recent Supreme Court?
Yeah, I mean, so there's a string of recent decisions that have completely shifted. So Kennedy v. Bremerton, case of Carson v. Macon, Espinoza v. Montana Department of Revenue, and Trinity Lutheran v. Comer are the big ones.
Oh, is that all?
Yeah, I'm rattling them off. But the notion is, so Kennedy v. Bremerton, for instance, you have a you have a football coach who's praying on the 50-yard line with his team, Christian prayer, as you might imagine, after a game. He's a public school representative praying. That was not allowed in the past. Essentially, like if you were a representative of the state, kids could pray in school. You could pray privately, but anything that might compel kids or be perceived to compel kids to participate in that prayer, not allowed, because it's an establishment of religion. That was at least that was the argument from the Warren Court. The argument here is like, well, it's protected speech, more or less, and he's not. So because he's religious in that space doesn't mean that he can't do it. And also the kids aren't compelled to be there. Now, if you've ever played sport,
the kids for sure have to be there.
Particularly football, if your coach is doing it, you might feel compelled to do it. He's not literally saying you have to do it here, but maybe that helps with playing time. Whatever. So anyways, it's a shift from this idea that Trinity Lutheran v. Comer was the idea that like there was funding for public schools in Missouri for playground equipment, and the Trinity Lutheran sued and said, well, we should have access to those funds.
But they charge tuition, and public schools
so there have been a lot, but because it's a state program, like the argument was, well, we should have equal access to it because we're an educational institute in the state. That was not something that existed in the past, and now it does. Because
that feels like bullshit to me, respectfully.
Well, the argument, I mean, listen.
I can understand the argument, but still, it's a private institution.
Right, exactly. So the idea was there were all of these laws in the past that said like all of these funds can really only go to public schools. That goes back to those Blaine amendments we were talking about, which were discriminatory against religious people. And so the Supreme Court is now doing away with those systematically. It's just saying like, well, this is discrimination against religious people as opposed to a lack of establishment.
Yeah, because the FBI was used to go after Christian people in the last administration. For people who are listening, there's a fat eye roll right now.
Yeah.
You know what I find interesting, though, is that we've seen a very explicit rise in Christianity in schools, right? With people trying to put Bibles in schools and 10 Commandments and all that stuff. But what I always found really interesting is the Pledge of Allegiance has never really gotten that attention. But yet you do say under God in the Pledge of Allegiance. And I know that was added in during the Cold War, but why do you feel like this has kind of escaped through and been okay?
I think because it was seen as a non-denominational God. And also you were allowed to opt out. So no one was compelled to say it.
I don't know. I went to public school and I remember a kid opting out and him getting yelled at.
Yeah. Oh, for sure. Like you have the legal right to opt out, but it means that in lots of these cases, it means that what you need is someone who's in a community that's predominantly whatever, who's going to have the wherewithal and the fortitude to stand up and say, well, I'm not going to do that. And then when they're punished for it, you bring a case. But yeah, that's absolutely how it works. It's a form of compulsion. I had a graduate student here who did a study on non-Christian teachers in the state of Georgia and all the ways in which in public schools Christianity was imposed on them. Sometimes small stuff, people come up and say, look, I'll pray for you, which is, that's totally fine. That's lovely. But also like events like the opening meeting for the year where all the teachers are brought to the Baptist church and that's where the meeting's held. And then there's a service at the front end of it. And what that takes then is in a community that may be predominantly Baptist, somebody being like, I'm not cool with that. So what are the repercussions for you? Like your life, you live there, your life is. So that's often how, well, you know this, that's how injustice persists in a community.
For sure. You mentioned that you grew up in a all-boys Christian school. What was that impact on you?
Yeah, so it's funny because we would not have called ourselves Christian. We would have said Catholic, but of course,
sorry, Catholic. I'm Jewish.
Oh,
it's all like
no, I know.
Jesus is one side to me.
Yeah. I'll tell you a story. I was in college at a Jesuit university in Boston, and I was out junior year doing things that people do junior year, maybe having some beers, and there was a young woman who was very drunk, and she came up to me at the party and she said, "You never look girls in the eyes." And I was like, "Oh, maybe I don't. I don't." Because in large part because, in the all male environment, like what you end up doing is you build these relationships with the boys in the space, and the inherent message there is like the divide between boys and girls is so fundamental that like we are just, it's the Mars and Venus nonsense, but we are so different from them and honestly superior that like we're not going to help you develop any kind of skills to be in a space with this person. And of course, the ways in which the Catholic Church, very particularly because of who gets to be in leadership roles and who has voice, like that certainly reinforces the idea that you might be socially awkward around girls, but you also might find yourself feeling pretty superior to them at any given time. So that's why I did my dissertation in that space, is to figure out, as I said, like what was wrong with me.
What an unlearning process.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, and I should say, like there are values from both Catholicism and from that experience that matter a great deal. And they matter in ways that are both beneficial and troubling. And that's, any kind of socialization for sure.
Frustrates me the most is the belief among people in these religious communities that the only way to teach morals is through religion. Mm-hmm. And I'm like, there's so many other ways to do so. That doesn't mean you have to tell someone to believe a certain thing or ascribe by rules within organized religion. Yeah. And that's always the thing that frustrates me. Yeah,
I think one argument would be that would be the role of a public education, is you're teaching ethics and morals. One of the arguments that we've made in the past is that even in secular public schools, there are undergirding religious values that, particularly Christian religious values, because of the kinds of discourses and histories and traditions that exist in those spaces, that then make those morals inherently Christian morals. So that's always something to keep an eye on. I mean, the easiest version of that is like, why do we give teachers apples? In large part because, so like the tree from the Garden of Good and Evil, which is a tovera from Hebrew, like it's everything from good all the way to evil, wasn't an apple. Like it would have been a tamarind or a fig because it was in the Middle East, but because of Renaissance representations and painting, like it was an apple. And so why do we give apples to teachers? Because they represent our ambivalence of the fact that they might bring us evidence and knowledge from good all the way to evil. Like that's
and I thought it was just a healthy snack.
Yeah, I know. Isn't that wild? Like maybe we're trying to keep you healthy, but also we're really worried about the kinds of things you might teach our kids.
That's wild. Who knew? That's actually
Isn't
crazy.
That fun? Yeah.
Yeah. No, that's really fun. So what's the impact of this? What's the conclusion of your research?
So we should talk a little bit about the NAR. This is drawing from Matthew Taylor's work and also some other scholars who are thinking about the Seven Mountain Mandate, which is something I didn't know about until this past year. But
what is that?
Yeah, that's good to find out. So it is a relatively recent theological tradition within non-denominational charismatic Christian communities. So the denominational charismatic communities, you might think of like Pentecostalism, and you can think about people who catch the Spirit, so speaking in tongues. There's a structure to the Pentecostal church. The non-denominational charismatic tradition is like, you just kind of found your own church. You may have someone that you studied under and that you work with, and then often there are networks of these things. But these are the people who are surrounding the president currently. So it used to be you'd have a relatively more conservative and staid religious right, people who were tied to some of the traditional mainline Protestant churches like Southern Baptist, you can think about most closely. But the difference in the NAR, the New Apostolic Reformation people, which is these non-denominational charismatics, is they believe in a couple different things. One would be demon mapping, which is not a thing I knew about, but you might know about it.
Is that like Pokemon?
It's the idea that if you believe that you can catch the Spirit, like the Holy Spirit is alive in the world, and it can enter you at any given time, which also might mean that there are elements of the devil or demons that are in the world all the time. And so what they believe is that you can do mapping in particular communities where you know where the demons are, and then you have prayer warriors who come in and pray and try to fight back against those demons. So
is that the language that's used?
Yeah.
In these circles?
Yeah. And then, so the idea of the Seven Mountain Mandate is like, in order for essentially the eschaton to happen, which would be, from Revelation, like the end times, one way
was that supposed to be a couple weeks ago?
It happens in cycles continuously. And we'll get back to that. So remind me, the idea is there's a prophetic tradition. Okay. So hang on to the prophetic tradition that's tied to this sort of demon mapping thing. But these seven mountains need to be dominated and taken over by Christians very specifically. And so those are the family, religion, media, arts and entertainment, government, education, and business. And that's going to bring about the eschaton and God's reign on earth. So if you really believe this stuff, and people do, I think it's a sincere belief, like your job on punishment of eternal damnation in hell, which is like a big deal, is to take these things over. And so what you see is these really influential pastors who are both male and female and actually like racially diverse in interesting ways, and often socioeconomically diverse in ways that like the leaders of the old religious right were not, are often in those pictures you see of people like laying hands on the president and praying for him. Like that's these people. And they're often like very much in the vein of old like television preachers. They are very much entrepreneurial and into raising money. But they're also doing this prophetic thing, which is like prophecy in this tradition is like, it has been given to me. And then if it doesn't happen, it doesn't mean that it was wrong. It means that we didn't pray hard enough for it to happen. So essentially, like God needs your prayers for a thing to happen. So you can be wrong all the time in your prophecy. It just means that like the people around you failed.
What great accountability.
Yeah, I mean, in a lot of ways, it just means you can say whatever and be wrong about it. And then if you're wrong about it, you have a fallback, which is like, well, it was demons or it was that we didn't pray hard enough. Now, I think these people in particular feel like you and I and whoever might be listening to this are really dismissive of these beliefs. And that's sort of the fuel that they get to say like, well, look at these godless liberals who are making fun of us for our beliefs. But it is to say that like these are genuinely held beliefs and we should be really troubled by them, because why would you compromise with your political enemies if you think they might be possessed by real demons? You wouldn't. So look at the way in which our government is structured right now.
Right. To be respectful of that.
Yeah. No, I know. But think about it as explanatory powers. Like think about the why of how government works now. With a guy like Mike Johnson, who is embedded in this sort of stuff, like he does not have any accountability to people like us or his voters, because he may have a prophet who's telling him that what you're doing is right. He may also believe that the people who, live in Portland or whatever need to have the military imposed on them because they're not rightly aligned in that hierarchy we talked about before. And they also might, like someone might have done a demon map. And
it just feels so like anti-Jesus to me. Like the literal preachings of Jesus, it feels like it goes completely against that.
Yeah, or also anti-democratic would be another version of that. But yeah, so there is an entire move that you may have heard about as well, that's related to undoing Christian empathy. So that's fun too. So
I'm learning so much right now.
So did I. I mean, this is like, as someone I think who grew up maybe in a religious tradition or like culturally religious, as did I, there are lots of things that my church believes that's, if you were to look at it, you'd be like, what in God's name are you talking about?
Literally,
like,
truly.
We would go, when I did my dissertation, I was at a school in Chicago on the South Side that had a piece of the finger bone of a saint. And we would go on Fridays and there would be like a prayer service around that. It's in a monstrance. It's seen in the church as like a second order or a first order relic of the saint. And like, you don't pray to the bone, but you pray for the intercession of the saint that they'll talk to God and help you out. Like that And I'm there and I'm like, yeah, no, I know. No, that's what people do. Like,
It's fascinating.
and you'd be like, what are you doing?
What is happening? I'm like, why is there a bone in this room?
Yeah, for sure. So it's like, it's all out there, but this is how people find structure and meaning in their lives,
It's fascinating for sure. So I think we started with what's next? How do we counter these problematic, I understand religion. I understand the importance that is to people, right? But the problematic notion of white nationalism that's been ingrained into Christianity, especially at those at the upper echelon of the government.
Yeah, the what's next is tough. This is the thing that we struggled with in that policy brief, because there's not a whole lot of evidence-based responses, unfortunately. So one version of that we wrote in there was like, listen, if you're going to give public money to religious schools, make them publish actively like the ways in which they're going to discriminate. So if it's an anti-LGBTQ school, at least require of them to say that in some way if they're going to take public funding. I don't know that will pass muster with the current Supreme Court because it will be compelled speech in some sort of way. But the idea is like, if you don't have a lot of levers of power, like at least make people be honest about their beliefs. Because these are beliefs I think that, those people sincerely hold in that space. And then people, if we really want choice, then people can make that kind of choice. I think the other version is there's an interesting opportunity to use this new religious freedom lever for people who are progressive religious believers. So there was a case in 2022 in Tennessee. A couple of Jewish mothers tried to sue under religious freedom grounds to get the anti-abortion laws stopped. They were,
I remember
because their religious belief would suggest that
we're always
they should
Jews
not
are
be
very much
controlled, right?
like pro. Got to take care of the mother.
Yeah. So the idea, I mean, they said they didn't have standing, but the idea might be like, okay, so if the Supreme Court is going to essentially say like religious freedom allows you to do lots of things that it didn't allow you to do in the public sphere, particularly in public education. Well, my religious belief would suggest that we shouldn't be doing prayer in the school, or my religious belief would say that we shouldn't be compelling people to do X, Y, or Z. Whether or not they'll find that argument convincing, who knows? But at least you can make the argument based on the things that they've written in the past. They're trying to get rid of stare decisis and like case law doesn't really matter, and they're just sort of making things up as they go. But at least, again, like the first one, like make them respond to it.
I know, but that was Project 2025, and it didn't do shit.
Well, it did something.
Yeah, it gave a great little blueprint to everything going on now, which I am always reminding people. They're like, why is this happening? I was like, they laid it out for you.
Yeah. I mean, and the same is true of, I think of, certainly our friends in the Christian nationalist movement. They're not afraid of it, and it's all embedded in Project 2025. And one of the things that I would say, and this is very briefly in the brief, and I was thinking about it earlier. There's a scholar named Chelsea Eben who does a really good job of pushing back on the idea that all of this stuff, so Project 2025, but going back to like the establishment of white flight academies and the closing down of public education in certain states because of Brown v. Board, like the idea that the religious right and conservatism is doing these things just as backlash. Essentially, if you guys hadn't pushed us, then this wouldn't be happening. And she's pretty convincing in making the argument that like, no, these are political actors who have prefigured an end that they want to get to. Like Project 2025, that whole 900-page document is not because liberals were supportive of a couple of trans kids. It's like a long-standing political project that sees an end that is already prefigured. And we have to, give, you would want to give your adversaries some credit for being really, really bright about that, but then also creating this like imagined halcyon past of like, well, if we could just go back to before, because you can make that up to be anything you want it to be. If it was just before this, when you guys made us do this thing, like things would be fine. So that prefiguration is really important. It's not backlash. Like the people had a plan and they're good at it.
No, they are.
We should have a plan and be better
Wouldn't
at
that
it.
be nice? If liberals had a plan, could be nice, Kevin. I'm not one to pray, but maybe I'll pray for that. Anything else you would like to touch on?
But there's the tenets of, like, if you think of Christian nationalism and what it wants in schools, should probably say, like, we had a couple listed, like, because education is a powerful social system, it should actively promote Christianity. Wokeness in the classroom is a danger to Christian values. Christians are victims of a secularizing society. There's that backlash thesis, right? Like, we're victims here. And they're subject to, like, godless brainwashing in public schools. And in order to prioritize Christian values, the end justifies the means. So, like, whatever we're going to do, because we have to reinforce that hierarchy, and because that hierarchy is God ordained, like that, and it's hard. So I'll give you a story, and then I can get out of your way. So Heidi, with whom I wrote the brief, she did her dissertation with 3 teachers, beginning teachers at UGA, and what we often have is we have teachers who come with religious beliefs, and then they go into public education and they really struggle, particularly those who come from evangelical traditions, because you're supposed to proselytize. That may now be legal in schools. It was not when Heidi wrote the book. And so there was a teacher of hers who really struggled with that, because she truly believed that, like, if she didn't proselytize with her students, she was going to go to hell. And so, like, every day that she was in school, and she was a great teacher and she supported her students really well, she took care of them in great ways, and she did not proselytize, at least not in ways that were particularly active. Like, she knew that she was signing her own, like, death warrant, more or less. And, like, that's heavy.
That's so sad. I feel so sad for her.
Yeah. And it, like, you can think of the internal conflict for her. And one argument is, like, well, she should teach in a religious context where she can do that. But, and this is not her argument at all. She was great. But the argument from, the New Apostolic Reformation or whatever is that public schools should be doing that work. And if we're not doing that work, then we're working actively against, essentially, like, Christian validation and the saving of the world.
It's fascinating. Just a friendly reminder to people that Judaism doesn't believe in hell. So come on over to the dark side, folks. But Kevin, it's been great to have you. This is, like, a very fascinating conversation that's so relevant, and it's fascinating research you guys did.
Thanks, Emily. It's great.
I appreciate it. And I'm your host, Emily Gross. We'll be back next week with another episode of Beerocracy.